Hello Internet, I'm Cold Matt, and welcome to the test pilot for a series I've been wanting to make for a long time. In this series I will be talking about some of my favorite directors and ranking their films from worst to best. Hardly an original idea, I know. In fact, even fellow small-time YouTuber Movie Mackle has a pretty similar show, which I will be in the first episode of, if he ever releases it. Michael, this is a fucking call-out. I recorded that shit in June. Where's the video? Anyways, I think there are a lot of directors to talk about, and plenty of different viewpoints to have, so I don't think this is that redundant. And I can't think of a director I would rather start with than my favorite director of all time, Mel Brooks. Brooks has had an undeniable impact on my sense of humor, on the way I write, on the way I view film. And on top of that, he's clearly had a big influence on the industry. He practically invented the spoof genre, and he's clearly been an inspiration for a great many people over the years. He's one of a handful of talented individuals who've achieved the EGOT, that is, an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony, and we'll talk about some of his other accomplishments throughout this video. I think Brooks is a great place to start, not just because he's my favorite director, but because he is, to start with, retired. In fact, Brooks is 93, so there's a very small chance he won't be alive by the time this video comes out. I really hope he doesn't die between now and then, but I can't rule that out. And even if he does die, I'm gonna leave that line in because it's what Brooks would have wanted. However, as of 2/15, August 20th, he's still alive. So unlike someone like Quentin Tarantino, he has finished making movies so I can rank his entire filmography and not have to worry that he's going to release another film anytime soon. On top of that, he's left behind a very manageable 11 films, unlike someone like Charlie Chaplin or Alfred Hitchcock, who've left behind 30 plus movies that I could never talk about in a video. This is basically a top 10 plus one. All that being said, let's go ahead and talk about Brooks's worst movie. Life Stinks, more like, this movie is a waste of my life. Got 'em! Life Stinks is the only movie Brooks has directed that I would call actively bad. He's made some below average movies, but this one is bad. There are a few moments in this film where Brooks's wit and comedic timing really shine through, but they are so few and so far between. Most of the jokes just fall flat on their face when they're even making jokes, which is another big problem with this movie. I don't know what tone they're going for. It's trying to be this lighthearted Mel Brooks comedy, but then it also wants to focus on these characters and their emotions and what they're going through. And I think you can balance those two ideas, but this movie doesn't. The film features Brooks in the star role as New York billionaire Goddard Bolt, clearly based on Donald Trump. See, before people hated Donald Trump for being a bad president, people hated Donald Trump for being a rich, egotistical asshole. So anytime you needed a villain who was a rich, egotistical asshole, you'd just base them on Donald Trump. There's Biff from Back to the Future Part 2, there's President Koopa from the Super Mario Bros. Movie, and of course there's Robert Clamp from the greatest movie ever made, Gremlins 2: The New Batch. Bolt has this idea to buy up the slums, bulldoze the area, and build a luxury resort on top of it. Bolt, much like Trump, was born into money, but his friend, played by Jeffrey Tambor, grew up in those slums, and challenges Brooks to a bet. If he can last 1 month as a homeless person in those slums, he has every right to buy the land and bulldoze it and build his luxury resort there. And you'd think maybe Tambor is doing this to, teach Bolt a lesson, oh, you gotta learn to love these people, and then you won't want to bulldoze this area to build a luxury resort on it. But it's actually because Tambor also wants to buy this land, and also wants to bulldoze it, and also wants to build a giant luxury resort on it. It seems like maybe there was an early draft of the film where Tambor was a good character, but they had to sort of have a twist somewhere, and they're like, nah, let's make him a bad character. And that's not a spoiler, his evil intentions are clear from the start of the film. Leslie Ann Warren plays Bolt's love interest, and she actually does a really good job in this film. I just wish it was on a better film than Life Stinks. I think there's a setup for an idea here, like billionaires are out of touch and don't know how the little people live, and plenty of good and mediocre jokes have been built on that concept, but they sort of overlook that and jump straight to, boy, it sure is gross to be poor. There's a scene where the Donald Trump character gets peed on. That's all I have to say about that. This film is just bad. I don't like it. Moving on. 1995's Dracula Dead and Loving It would be Brooks's final film, and I can kind of see why. Not that I think this is an absolute career killer. If it had come out earlier in Brooks's career, like sometime after Young Frankenstein, I could see him bouncing back from this. But for the time it came out, it was just a really clear indication of where both Brooks and the genre as a whole stood. And it was pretty clear to everyone it was time for Brooks to hang up his hat and move on to something else. Which he has done with a lot of acting and voice acting appearances since then. I'm glad he's staying active, but as for directing, his final film was not that great. There are good jokes in this movie. I do get laughs out of it every time I watch it. But it's that thing where you throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, and not that much is sticking. Not nearly as much as was sticking in Brooks's earlier films. By 1995, the spoof genre, which Brooks helped pioneer, was not in a good place. Granted, it was better than it would get with later installments like Epic Movie and Meet the Spartans, but, it was still not a good time for the genre. And the fact that Mel Brooks, the guy who started this trend, made a movie that was basically indistinguishable from Wrongfully Accused or Spy Hard or whatever else was coming out in the mid-90s, said a lot about where he and the genre were. It had definitely deteriorated a lot since its golden age in the late 70s and 80s. Also, the fact that Mel Brooks, a guy known for doing a Frankenstein parody, would dip back into the universal well just sort of reeks of desperation. Again, if he had done this right after Young Frankenstein, that'd have made sense, and even if the film wasn't that good, he could bounce back from it. But by the mid-90s, it's like that time had passed. The fact that he decided to go back to this, again, really reeks of desperation. And he cast Leslie Nielsen in it, and I feel like Leslie Nielsen got so misused later in his career. Leslie Nielsen was not a funny actor. What was funny about Leslie Nielsen is that he would deliver every line exactly as seriously as every other line. So when you have him say something absurd, like someone says the options were beef or fish, and he goes, "Oh yes, I had the lasagna," it's funny because he just does it with such a straight face. He never breaks character to say these goofy, wacky things. He was so misused late in his career. He was not a funny actor. He was funny because he was a serious actor. Anyways, Dracula Dead and Loving It. If you're a Brooks fan, it might be worth checking out just to see where he was at that late in his career. And there's some good jokes in there, again, that I laughed at. But overall, it's not one of his films I would recommend to the masses. From the end of Brooks's career to near the beginning, 12 Chairs is the second film Brooks directed right after The Producers. The Producers had won him an Oscar for Best Writing, and was pretty successful at the time. Thus, he was given a blank check to do whatever he wanted, and he chose to make an adaptation of this Soviet play that there were already 40 adaptations of at the time. I don't know why this play was so popular. I hadn't heard of it before I watched the Brooks film, and offhand, I could not tell you if there was a better adaptation than the Brooks film. The story goes that a rich Russian noble, that is a tongue twister, sewed all of her jewelry and precious items into a chair in a set of 12 chairs at the start of the revolution. However, she was not able to take it with her when she fled the country, and now that she's on her deathbed, she confesses to her son and a priest that she had sewed these items into the chair, and they go off looking for these 12 chairs. Hence the title. So, of course, there's sort of a mad dash to collect these 12 chairs and find the lost diamonds and jewelry and all that. It's a pretty simple setup that I think has the potential for a lot of comedic moments. And there's certainly laughs to be had in the Brooks adaptation, although it's not, that funny. I have no idea what was written by Brooks versus what was in the original play. I'm just saying this adaptation doesn't totally capitalize on some of the jokes I think it could be making. One pretty good thing about the film is the performances. Notably, Dom DeLuise plays the priest. It was the first collaboration between DeLuise and Brooks, who would go on to work together on several more movies. DeLuise is hilarious in this movie. This is one of his funniest performances. On top of that, I think the other two actors, whose names are escaping me. On top of that, Ron Moody and Frank Langella both have their time to shine in this movie. Even Brooks has a minor role in the film, and it's probably his best performance. Brooks is known for being very, very Jewish, but he pulls off a Russian man quite well in this film. Still, though, it's just kind of mediocre, and I don't know why Brooks chose to adapt this play. However, maybe it was a bit of a blessing in disguise, because after this film didn't take off, Brooks agreed to work on Blazing Saddles, which, sort of turned his career around. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Robin Hood Men in Tights is a movie I have heard a lot of people praise, and I get why that is, but I kinda disagree. Here's the thing about Robin Hood Men in Tights. The jokes that work really land. There are a lot of jokes that are really funny in this movie. And the jokes that don't land just kinda So over time you sort of forget the lamer jokes of this movie, and you catch it on TV one day and you go, oh, Robin Hood Men in Tights, this is funny, and you quote all your favorite lines, and then, the lesser parts come on and you're like, hey, this isn't as good as I remember. And then you don't watch it for a year or two, and it comes on TV again, and you're like, hey, Robin Hood Men in Tights, this movie's hilarious. And the cycle continues. What I notice about this film is that Brooks has recycled a lot of jokes. There's the walk this way joke from Young Frankenstein, the moving mole is a reference to the moving hump, there's the do you joke from Spaceballs. Even the big third act musical number that Brooks is known for is just Jews in Space from History of the World Part 1. It parodies the Kevin Costner Robin Hood movie, which is a really fucking lame movie. So, I don't know if that helps or hurts the film. Not a lot of people remember the Kevin Costner Robin Hood. In fact, Robin Hood Men in Tights is probably better remembered than the Kevin Costner Robin Hood. So again, a mixed bag. There's good jokes, there's bad jokes. Really, I think I've said all I have to say about this film. You remember the good jokes, you forget the bad jokes. It's not as good as you remember. If you watch it again, you will realize how many lame and recycled jokes there are. But I'm not gonna deny, I still laugh every time this movie's on. High Anxiety, Brooks's tribute to and parody of the films of Alfred Hitchcock. The film is mostly a parody of Vertigo, although it has little vignettes where it parodies other films like Psycho and The Birds, etc., etc. I gotta say, I'm a little disappointed by this movie. Not that there aren't funny jokes in it, but it just doesn't do a very good job lampooning anything about the way Alfred Hitchcock makes movies. It's more like a string of comedic sketches based on scenes from Alfred Hitchcock films, and doesn't really have anything to say about Hitchcock or his work. They don't even do a very good job capturing Hitchcock's aesthetic, which is one of the things I really credit some of Brooks's other films for. Like, part of what makes Young Frankenstein so hilarious is that it looks like a Frankenstein movie. Like, if you just didn't know anything about Young Frankenstein and saw this footage, you'd be like, whoa, it's a Frankenstein movie. And then, you have that moment where they pull the rug out from under you and, oh, it's a goofy comedy. High Anxiety doesn't have that. It doesn't look like a Hitchcock film. It looks like a Mel Brooks film. Brooks also tends to be very good at writing characters, but the main characters of this film are just Mel Brooks and Madeline Kahn playing Mel Brooks and Madeline Kahn. Which, to be fair, Mel Brooks and Madeline Kahn are hilarious, but there's nothing special about their characters. High Anxiety is good for laughs. It is not a good parody movie, and it is not good for much else besides just a couple laughs based on some Hitchcock films. And that's kind of disappointing, because I'd really like to see Brooks really dig his teeth into the style of Alfred Hitchcock, but I guess we'll never get to see that movie now. High Anxiety was sort of a love letter to Alfred Hitchcock, and Silent Movie is a love letter to silent movies. However, unlike Alfred Hitchcock, Brooks does a really good job tributing old silent movies. This movie is really funny. If you love old silent comedies, this is the perfect movie for you. The very minor problems I have with this movie are that it sort of recycles some jokes from old silent pictures. So it's not like the most original movie, but I think what Brooks has done here by combining all these ideas together is pretty unique in and of itself. Like I said, it is a love letter to these types of silent films, and as someone who loves these old silent films, that does it for me. And it's clear Brooks is as big a fan of these silent films as I am, because he does a pitch-perfect job making a hilarious comedy out of them. Honestly, I really like Silent Movie. This is the part of the list where we're getting into Brooks's good movies, and this one is definitely worth checking out. I'm a huge fan of it, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. History of the World Part 1, a movie that started as a joke. Someone asked Brooks what his next film was going to be, and he said, History of the World Part 1, and then he made it. It's something of a sketch movie, with each individual time period having its own little story and story arcs. And every segment is just so funny. There are so many good jokes, the stories and characters all work in every time period. I want to give Brooks a lot of credit here. He really captures the aesthetic of a lot of movies set in these days. This really looks like a historical epic. This is like something Dino De Laurentiis would have been putting out at the time. It's, pretty nice to look at. It just fits that aesthetic so well. It feels like a genuine look at history, but with all of these crazy, goofy, inappropriate jokes strewn in throughout. Really, this is an absolute classic of Brooks's, and if you haven't seen it, get on it. I love it so much. Am I going to get in trouble for putting Young Frankenstein this low on the list? I mean, it's number 4, and it's a film I absolutely love. Just Brooks has a lot of really good movies. Give me a break, people. Also, between you, me, and the floorboards, I'm kind of torn between this one and History of the World Part 1. If you put both movies in front of me, there's like a 50-50 chance I'm going to pick History of the World Part 1 over this. That said, taking a step back and looking at this film in context, this clearly had a bigger effect on Brooks's career than History of the World Part 1 did. So it gets the higher placement just for being more important. And again, I love Young Frankenstein. Everyone loves Young Frankenstein. There are just some things that keep me from putting it higher. It's a little slower than some of his other films. It's a little more reliant on sex jokes than his other films. It doesn't go quite as off the wall in as many places. It is pretty restrained, but it does manage to be very funny in those restraints. Again, I'd like a movie that's a little goofier, but for what it is, this is a hilarious and classic movie. If you have not seen Young Frankenstein, and you're watching this video about Mel Brooks, who even fucking are you? Watch Young Frankenstein. Now, I know what you're thinking. Matt, isn't Spaceballs your favorite movie of all time? And yeah, it is. It absolutely is. But I can be objective and say it's not Brooks's best. Spaceballs is special to me personally because of the context in which I saw it. I was a huge Star Wars fan. I had never seen a spoof movie before, and it really warped my perception on how movies are made. It was this film that made me really realize you can do anything in a movie. And that has absolutely shaped the way I look at films since watching Spaceballs. That said, it's not Brooks's best film. It's very funny. I love it. It's one of his best. But it's not his absolute peak. Noteworthy, while some of his other films are big love letters to the genre, this feels much less like a love letter to Star Wars. It kind of feels like it's hitting on a popular trend at the time, rather than being something Brooks is just absolutely enamored with. Still, I think it has some of his funniest jokes, some of his funniest characters, some of the best performances in any Mel Brooks movie. It's just a laugh riot, start to finish. Like, you guys know I love Spaceballs. I got the shirt, I got the stuff. It's Spaceballs. You know I love Spaceballs. Top 2, here we go. The Producers, Brooks's first film. And what a film to start with. Here Brooks is knocking it out of the park right on his first try. This movie is so hilarious. The dialogue is great. The characters are great. Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder giving two of the funniest performances of all time. Genuinely, if you asked me to pick the funniest performance of all time, it'd be a tie between Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder in this movie. They're so perfect. It's this wild, crazy idea about, making a flop play and turning that into a tax evasion scheme. It's such a wild story. It's one of those things, it's like, man, I'd like to try this, but that's kind of illegal, so instead, I'm gonna write a movie about it. And, of course, the play Springtime for Hitler. I do know, however, that Springtime for Hitler is hilarious, and I have always thought it was hilarious from the first time I watched this movie. And every time I watch it, I just find something new to love about it. It's so funny. It's so hilarious. It's one of my, top 20 favorite movies of all time. And it's Brooks' second best film, second only to, of course... What can I say about Blazing Saddles? It invented spoof movies. Satire existed before. The types of jokes you saw in Blazing Saddles had been done before. But no one had ever put pen to film and made something this absurd and off the wall and just really digging into the genre of westerns. And especially at the time it came out, westerns had been popular since about the 50s, and the market was way oversaturated. Everyone was getting tired of the genre. And as much as Brooks says he loves westerns, and I believe him, I think this was a huge love letter to the genre, it also killed the genre. Now you can talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think the end was near whether this film had been made or not. This was just that final nail in the coffin to make sure westerns were not coming back. But on top of that, it's one of the funniest movies ever made. Every joke works. Except maybe like the weird homophobic shit in the third act, but what are you gonna do? It was the 70s. I love it. I love everything about this film. I think it's a brilliant work of art. I've talked about it before on this channel. It was a pretty short video, but, I just love it. It's Brooks' best film. It's Brooks' most important film. And, frankly, one of the most important films of all time. What do I say about Blazing Saddles that hasn't been said already? I love it to pieces. Please watch Blazing Saddles. And that's going to conclude this pilot episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more videos like this. What other directors you'd like to see me cover. That might not play that big, that might not really influence me. I kind of already have the directors picked out. If I did another one, it'd probably be John Carpenter. John Carpenter would be my next pick. And until next time, I hope you have a lovely day. R.I.P. Mel Brooks, if he dies before this comes out. Or, if you're watching this in the future and Mel Brooks has died. Because, eventually he will die. So, if you're watching this after Mel Brooks' death, R.I.P. Mel Brooks.